In this video lecture, we'll look at several different ways of using Marx and his ideas. We'll divide that use in three broad categories. First, we'll look at examples of thinkers who were trying to figure out what he really meant. Then, we'll look at examples of thinkers who were trying to figure out what else he should have said. And finally, there's a category of theorists who use some of Marx's ideas but openly break up with him. Two of the most prominent interpreters of Marx are Hungarian Gerd Lukács and Italian Antonio Gramsci. Lukács connected two of Marx's central concepts, class and historical materialism, and what he called class consciousness. Remember that for Marx, history follows a particular logic. That logic revolves around how things are produced in society and how much productive capacity exists in a society. For example, think about how the Industrial Revolution signifies the end of feudalism and the beginning of capitalism by changing the entire social, political, and economic order. Within those macro-historical processes, Marx argues, there are always groups of people who fight for power. In a feudal society, then, the bourgeois class is the revolutionary class that challenges the dominance of the feudal class. Once established, though, the bourgeois class, the capitalist class in a capitalist society, is the dominant class, and it's up to the working class to be the new revolutionary class. This is where Lukács picks up and says that what needs to happen for the working class to really be that revolutionary class is for it to develop a class consciousness. So workers have to realize not only that they are a group that has collective interests and that is being exploited by a dominant class, but they also need to realize and understand that they have a historical role to play. And in playing that role, they will end up creating a new socioeconomic order where things are organized around the interests of the working class. However, Lukács argues that cannot happen while there are social classes who are looking out for the interests of other social classes rather than their own. He calls that false consciousness. A great example of that is the contemporary working class, which predominantly votes for a political party whose main goals are to protect the interests of the capitalist class. To explain that paradox, the concept of hegemony comes in handy, which Gramsci argues is the main reason why a dominant class can maintain its dominant position with the tacit acceptance of the other classes in a society. For example, modern capitalism makes it virtually impossible for people not to participate in a culture of consumerism. On the one hand, the masses in that consumerist culture want to have more things available at lower prices so that they're more affordable, which of course means more profit for the capitalist class. But more importantly, it means that the masses agree to be exploited and actively support their own exploitation. Remember that Marx demonstrates that profit requires exploitation. So then a working class or even a middle class that predominantly supports a socioeconomic system based on profit is therefore experiencing false class consciousness. You should pause the video here and take the first part of the quiz. While theorists like Lukács and Gramsci elaborate on Marx's ideas while remaining within his framework, others extend his ideas and concepts beyond the issues that he was interested in. That's what critical theorists do. Critical theory is notoriously difficult to define because despite its name, it is not a set of coherent theoretical ideas. Instead, it's a statement of affinity for Marx and a particular type of relationship with Marx. Critical theorists emphasize the importance of Marx's ideas, but they also recognize that his concepts need to be updated and extended in order for them to apply to issues in contemporary capitalism. Critical theorists also recognize that revolutionary change is not the only way in which structural change happens in society. The goal of the Frankfurt School in critical theory in particular was to study, understand, critique, and eventually offer constructive ways of changing modern capitalist society. Although frequently collaborating, the members of the Frankfurt School had interests going in a number of different directions. For example, Adorno focused on aesthetics, Horkheimer focused on social psychology, Benjamin on literary critique, Marcuse on the role of technology, and Fromm on psychology. Again, Marx was central to the way they thought about the world and the way each one of them approached their respective areas, and they were all heavily influenced by the works of Lukács and Gramsci. Another example of extending Marx beyond his original framework is cultural studies, whose leading figure, Stuart Hall, was interested in using Marx to study everyday practices and meanings. Cultural studies focuses on connecting ideologies of race, class, and gender with cultural practices. Similar to critical theory, cultural studies is not a unified theoretical paradigm. What is common for cultural studies thinkers is the way they use Marx and his concept and their general approach to analyzing the social world. It is fairly common for cultural studies to apply Marxian concepts to mass communication and media. You can pause the video here and continue with the quiz. In the end, we'll look at a couple of examples of theorists who use Marx's concept, but they critique his general framework. For instance, Anthony Giddens does not identify as a Marxist, but recognizes that Marx's analysis of capitalist production is incredibly influential in his own work. And we can see hints of Marx's ideas behind Giddens's concepts, even if Marx is not officially recognized. Giddens's most important contribution is a theory of social change, structuration theory, where the idea is that micro-developments are organized over time in a way that they result in macro changes. For instance, think of the rise of social media over the past years and the ways in which social media and the use of social media has transformed collective action during the Arab Spring or the Occupy protests or the Taksim Square protests in Turkey. In that last example, resulting in the Turkish government banning and blocking the use of social media. So there's definitely a hint of materialism here. Material conditions change, and as they do, social, political, and economic structures change. There is also a hint of class and power, because in the end, individual practices and consciousness become collective practices and collective consciousness. So we can then talk about conflicts between groups or class conflict. Although more of a self-identified Marxist compared to Giddens, Bourdieu critiques Marx very strongly. For example, Bourdieu thinks that Marx's idea of social class is too narrow, It only focuses on economic conditions. Instead, Bourdieu offers his own concept, which he calls the habitus, which brings together structural, cultural, and psychological considerations. A person's habitus, on the one hand, is individual, but then it can also be shared with a larger group of people. A person's habitus depends on the social position that they occupy in a society, which includes social class, and can be studied by studying material social facts like practice. For example, in his book Distinction, Bourdieu finds that the cultural consumption, in other words, the art that people like, is specific to their habitus. He finds that working class and less educated Frenchmen prefer music that's more melodical, whereas more educated Frenchmen prefer music that they consider to be more complex. This has nothing to do with an objective gradation of music or art, and has everything to do with the type of cultural capital that different groups of people acquire. So if you were educated and socialized to understand, quote unquote, understand complex harmonies or disharmonies, which of course is associated with a particular social location, then you would consider music that has a very simple and straightforward melody to be low quality music. On the other hand, if you grew up in a context where easy to listen ambience background type of music was preferred, then you would find complex harmonies and disharmonies to just be noise. This concludes the video lecture. Please finish the quiz.